Okay, so what I'm going to try and do in this talk is to really try and turn a lot of the debates around the impact of higher education on their head. So what normally happens in a lot of these debates is that people start from measuring the impact of research. The impact of research, measuring the impact of research, has a much longer history than the measurement of the impact of teaching and the measure of the impact of engagement. And so what people tend to do is they tend to say, okay, this is how we do it in relation to research. How do we apply that to teaching? So, for example, in England at the moment, we have the development of the Teaching Excellence Framework, which comes out of the Research Excellence Framework that we had before, and the kinds of discussions around how we measure teaching excellence are very heavily informed by the way in which we measure research excellence. And I want to take it from the other end. I want to say, okay, what does all the research that's been done over the last 40 years into teaching and learning in higher education, how might that enable us to understand impact? Does impact look different when we consider it from the perspective of teaching and learning? And if we then apply that to research, does the measurement and thinking about research impact begin to look different? So if we start thinking about measures of research impact, in the UK, as I've already mentioned, we have a research excellence framework in which departments and institutions, the quality of their research is measured. And in terms of impact, what they do is they produce a number of impact case studies that produce a narrative argument for the impact that's been had. At a project level, the EU Horizon 2020 project, EU Horizon 2020 funding expects projects to contribute to public debate and the tackling of societal challenges. And the idea of all of these things is a focus in which individual projects have impact. Okay? And so the way this looks is that there's a project. That project is translated in some way, the outcomes of that project are translated, and that leads to impact. And if we think about this as a model of impact, there's a number of things it highlights. First of all, if we want to ask questions about who owns this impact, then it's obvious. The project owns the impact. If we want to develop metrics to measure this impact, then it's obvious what we do. We look at the project and we measure what that project's done, and it's all owned by the project. And this kind of way of thinking has a sort of refrain that's often used in relation to impact, which is dissemination is not the same as impact. Okay, that disseminating something is not the same as that thing having an impact. And it's interesting that that kind of way of talking is very strongly associated with this view of impact. If we then think about measures of teaching impact, as I've said, they're less fully developed. In some ways, in a number of ranking systems, university league tables, then graduate salaries is often taken as a measure of impact. How much a student earns having done a degree shows how much that degree has impacted on society. That's deeply problematic for a number of ways, I think. And so the OECD, in their assessment of higher education learning outcomes projects, has tried to look at learning outcomes and compare them. And what these kind of projects often do is, as I mentioned in my previous talk, they tend to end up focusing generically. So what the main thrust of the HEInnovate project is to compare the generic skills that students develop through higher education. And in England, again, rather than the UK, in England, again, in preparation for the Teaching Excellence Framework I've mentioned, we have a number of learning gains projects, which again seek to measure what students gain from their undergraduate degrees. Okay? So if we think about this as a measure of impact, what we have is something where there's some teaching of some kind, the students learn something, and then this has an impact. So again, if we say who owns this impact, then it's the teaching, the institution, maybe the student to a certain extent. If we want to develop metrics to measure this teaching impact, it looks a relatively simple task to engage with. And interestingly, we have a similar refrain that we had in relation to research impact. So whilst it was that dissemination does not equal impact, In research, in respect to teaching, it's that teaching does not equate to learning. That just because you've taught something, students haven't necessarily learnt it, which to me suggests that these ways of thinking are quite aligned in terms of the way they project a certain view of impact, a certain view of who owns impact, and a certain view in relation to how easy it is to measure impact through metrics. So to bring in a bit of educational research into this, Basil Bernstein did a seminal body of work looking at the ways in which knowledge gets translated at the level of society. So the notion of the pedagogic device is not a device in terms of a teaching device, it's situated at the level of societies. And what Bernstein was doing with this is saying, okay, how does knowledge get transformed as it moves from research that academics might produce into curriculum, and he was particularly focused on school curriculum, and then how does that then get transformed when students come into relation to it? And the crucial thing for me that Bernstein argues is that knowledge as research is not the same as knowledge as curriculum. So when you've got a body of academic knowledge and you say, okay, we're going to form a curriculum here, what happens is there's power struggles, there's contestation. Employers have a view, professional organisations have a view about what should be taught on this accountancy degree. Some academics have their favourite subject that they insist is included. You know, there might be a national qualification framework that sets the context. So what happens is the structure of a curriculum is not the same as the structure of knowledge as research. It's transformed through contestation and argument. And a similar way, when students engage with knowledge, they don't do it as if they're tabula rasa, as if they just take it in exactly the form that it was taught to them. They relate it to their own biographies and experiences. They relate it to what they've learned before. And it's transformed and it's changed. So what this model really emphasises is how power struggles in different forms actually change knowledge as it moves across society. So in relation to teaching and learning, what we have is a sense of knowledge going through transformational interactions with many voices of employers, of academics, of students, actually coming together to form a curriculum, and then this again being transformed through interactions into student understanding. And then similarly, we can think about research, where this body of knowledge starts, and then through transformational interactions moves into a translation device. And again, there'll be contestation. It's not that knowledge has impact in a pure form that goes straight from the laboratory into people's homes. There's a number of interactions that change it as it moves into this translation device. And again, once it's translated, as it starts to have impact, again, there are transformational interactions that shift it and change it and move its meaning. So what I'm trying to do with this, I'm saying, okay, so if we think about teaching and learning as the shift of knowledge through these different forms, what does that do to our understandings of impact? How do our understandings of impact change as a result of this way of thinking about the way in which knowledge is transformed as it moves from knowledge as research to knowledge as curriculum to knowledge as understanding? So if we move back to teaching impact, we have the model that I started with of teaching leading to student learning that leads to impact, in which it's very clear who owns the impact. It's the teachers and it's the students, and it's very easy how we can measure this impact. Well, if we then bring the pedagogic device into this and think, okay, now let's take the lesson from that and think about what impact looks like, then it starts to look very different. First of all, we start with the collective body of knowledge. That's the position where the curriculum's initially formed. And then that collective body of knowledge is transformed into curriculum, and then transformed into teaching and learning interactions, and then transformed again into student understanding, and then it might finally be transformed into impact. So if we now say, who owns this impact? Suddenly it becomes a much more difficult question to answer. Does the body of knowledge own the impact? Maybe it's not the institution. Maybe it's the discipline that students are engaged with that owns the impact. Or maybe it's all the voices that came together to form the curriculum. The employers, the professional bodies, maybe they own some of the impact. Or maybe it's what happened within the teaching and learning interactions. Or maybe it's a large degree to do what then students did with all of that material. Or maybe the opportunities they had after graduation that led to the impact. So suddenly a simple answer to the question of who owns impact becomes unconvincing. Similarly, if we think about, so what metric could we use to measure this? It suddenly looks much more difficult. It might be that we can have metrics to help us to support our understanding, but a single metric that's going to tell us what was the impact of this particular course suddenly becomes something that looks quite unconvincing. Similarly, if we look at research. So research impact, this notion that projects are then translated and then have impact. Okay, which is largely the model. If you look at funding councils, as I said, such as European funding councils, this is a model. You need to show your project has impact. And this has always been something that's worried me, in the sense of any one project might be an outlier. Any one project might have a set of results that are just particular to that project. Surely it should be the collective body of knowledge we need to listen to across a range of projects, across a range of contexts, rather than putting all of this pressure on the individual project to tell us something and to have impact. So thinking in terms of pedagogic device, again, helps us with this. So again, we start with the collective body of knowledge. Most research projects start with a sense of, okay, where are the gaps in this body of knowledge? How is this particular project going to address what's not been done before? And so that's always done in relation to what we already know. And so the project then comes out of that collective body of knowledge in some form. But crucially, it then goes back into that collective body of knowledge. The outcomes from any research project only make sense in relation to particular bodies of knowledge. They don't stand for themselves. They don't tell us about the world in an unmediated way. They tell us about the world in relation to what we've known before. And then they are translated and transformed through transformational interactions. And so what happens here in thinking about impact is actually who has impact and who owns impact again becomes a much more difficult question to answer. Actually, is it the business partners and who got involved in translating and transforming the original idea from the collective body of knowledge who had the impact? Is it actually the original members of the research field, the men and women who developed those ideas that led to the project? How much do they own the impact? And so this idea that you can trace the impact back to an individual project and say this project, or even back to an individual institution and say this institution has had impact, suddenly becomes very questionable. The idea that you can have metrics that will very simply tell you how much impact this particular area has had suddenly become much more problematic, because we know it's about people acting collectively, people contributing to collective bodies of knowledge, rather than individual projects or individual institutions having impact. So to the so what question. So generally what I'm arguing is that current approaches to thinking about impact tend to obscure the crucial roles played by collective bodies of knowledge, the ways in which these are collectively transformed into usable material, and the role of contestation, of people arguing at each stage about what should be included and what should be excluded. Who has the power to claim this as their impact? Who's a convincing person to say, actually, yeah, it's my stuff that did it, it was me, and who says that just looks ridiculous? And for me, it's very noticeable that I haven't talked in terms of engagement. Okay, I've simply taught in terms of teaching and research. And actually, for me, this way of thinking about impact actually puts engagement with teaching and research. Engagement is about taking the knowledge that we've gained from teaching and research and translating it into a usable form to be engaged with by society. So the idea that the third mission is something different from the rest of the knowledge venture of higher education, for me, starts to become a less obvious question. So in all, I would say that many approaches to impact tend to be individualized, they tend to be ahistorical, they tend to pretend, they tend to pretend that there's nothing that happened to make this exist as an impact. It tends to imply that impacts are waiting for us in the world to go out and pluck, rather than actually we make an argument for impact. We draw on metrics, we draw on narratives, and we try and produce a convincing narrative of why this impact stands. And what instead that gives us, if we think about impact in that way, is it's far more a court of law than a laboratory. It's far more about weight of evidence than it is about uncontestable metrics showing us where the impact lies. And finally, because it's about collective bodies of knowledge, because these bodies of knowledge are collectively owned, rather than owned by any individual researchers, research groups or institutions, then actually thinking about the impact at the level of society starts to make a lot more sense than looking at the level of institutions. Because knowledge isn't bounded by institutions. The knowledge doesn't stop at the front door of a university. It moves throughout the system with people working collectively and internationally to contribute to it. So actually thinking about impact at the level of a system from this perspective makes a lot more sense than it does thinking about impact at the level of an institution.